let me present you Danny, a former schoolmate of mine, and he's between an electrical engineer and a programmer. He likes to hack embedded systems. Also, lately he worked on mobile phones, and he implemented some of these payment solutions for mobile phones as well. And let's listen to him about electronic payment.
Hello. So this talk is going to be about one very specific and very old and surprisingly hard problem of the web, which is charging viewers for content. So back in 1992, when Tim Berners-Lee added status codes to this HTTP thing of his, then he could think of only 5 reasons for refusing serving content and blaming it on the client. So those 5. And you can see that the middle 3 sort of have a similar semantics, meaning that the resource does exist, but the server thinks that the client has no right of viewing it. And the first one, authorization required, actually provides the user with the means of rectifying the situation. As you can see, those numbers in the braces are actually Google counts, hit counts. So you can see that of all of these, 402 is for all of these. 402 is by far the most obscure, and I'm not sure if any one of you have ever encountered this status code. Now, of course, later, many more status codes were added, some of them even more obscure, and even my favorite, 418, which is what network-connected teapots are supposed to return when someone requests coffee over HTTP, namely, I'm a teapot. And I believe there are many reasons for the unpopularity of 402, and one of them can be illustrated by an analogy aptly noted by everyone's favorite supplier of geek apparel, ThinkGeek. So if you think of this analogy, the semantics behind 402 would be abundantly clear, but we have certain social conventions against making it explicit. And I believe that on the web, even though the social conventions are not that strong, the sentiment still exists that it's somehow wrong to do that. And if we try to make a case for charging users for viewing content, then what some media executives would tell you that, you know, producing quality content is hard, it takes a lot of time and effort, and it should be compensated. But in my opinion, that's just plain old arrogant greed, because if you think on the other side that, you know, reading the content also takes time and effort, so maybe New York Times should pay me for reading it. So I believe that the real reasons they lie elsewhere. So we have this old problem of, you know, who should be producing content, what content should be produced, how much time should be spent producing this content. So all this is lumped under the general problem of resource allocation and you know, finding out what content people want to see. And obviously there are many algorithms for doing this efficiently, and your company is actually excellent at inventing such algorithms and implementing them. But for a very long time, humanity has used and discovered long time ago a distributed, very robust, and surprisingly scalable algorithm for efficient resource allocation, the market. And it's a very natural idea. It occurred to Berners-Lee even before 404, which was an even more obvious idea, but still it occurred to him that maybe, you know, having people directly paying for content that they want to see is a good idea because it will help solving all these problems. And people have been trying and failing, and most of the failures end up being such that the reason the solution is not being used is that people hate it with a red-hot passion. And when I started working on payment systems, that was back in 2003, 2004, I started experimenting and finding out why everybody has failed and how we could possibly succeed. And in order to do that, I looked into a science of human decision-making, which is called economics, and I'm by no means an expert, so I just found that even some of the most basic results are surprisingly relevant, very useful, and undeservedly overlooked and ignored. So the purpose of this talk is to raise awareness of economics and its relevance to designing human-computer interfaces, in particular for the purpose of payment. So let me begin with a very superficial and very brief introduction to economics. So economists have this very, very simple yet surprisingly powerful model of a human decision maker, which is the rational actor, rational player. By rational, they mean that he has some concept of costs and benefits, and they may be different for different people. But nevertheless, the decisions that people end up making are such that they tend to minimize their costs and maximize their benefits. And it is a consequence, so it's not an axiom, it's actually a consequence of several things, that if people do that and they are free to exchange the things that they have, and the costs of transactions are minimal, and everybody's well informed, and so on and so forth, then we will achieve efficient resource allocation, where efficient also has a very specific meaning, namely that if we change that resource allocation, then necessarily somebody will be worse off. So an efficient resource allocation is which cannot be improved in the sense that we cannot make someone better off without also making someone else worse off. And an inefficient resource allocation is one that can be improved in such a way that everybody is better off. But that if here is a very, very big if. So it's not at all clear that under any circumstances, if we just introduce a market, then it will magically solve everything. And I will explore these problems a little bit more in detail. And one of the things when we're talking about information, we of course cannot assume that everybody is well informed because they want information in the first place. So the first assumptions that we drop is that everybody is well informed. No, there are many, many relevant pieces of information that people do not have. And therefore, these pieces of information are modeled with certain probabilities that people attach to, if I do this, if I take this decision, then this might happen, that might happen, that might happen, and subjectively I assign certain probabilities to them. And then we can also figure out how people decide. And the most obvious model, the simplest model, which is unfortunately not quite accurate, is that people simply maximize the expected utility. So they calculate or they somehow have a feeling of the utility of the different outcomes that their decision might entail, and they somehow try to maximize the expected utility. And instead of building more and more complicated models of humans, there's another school of economics, which is called behavioral economics, which sort of attacks the problem from the opposite direction. And what they do is they say, well, let's look at how people actually make decisions. Let's look at their decisions and try to work backwards how people actually, what people might have had in mind for making those decisions. And the updated theory is that they introduce certain tweakings into the expectations, and instead of expected utility theory, that is called prospect theory. And you can look it up, what results they have. But basically what happens is that they introduce certain additional costs that people are obviously aware of. The opportunity cost of a decision is that if I decide to do something, it obviously stops me from doing something else. And that might have some other benefits that I lose this way. So the cost of the missed opportunities. And it seems like people are painfully aware of these opportunity costs. So if we make the impression that by deciding something, people lose something else, that will not be very popular. And it will be very relevant to interface design. The other thing is that mental accounting itself has a certain cost, meaning that if you have to stop and think about decisions, it's bothersome. So it's also something that is perceived as a loss. And there are some well-established phenomena in behavioral economics, and I believe that the jury is still out on the reasons behind them, so they're still arguing why they are, but the phenomena themselves are very well established, and they're all related. You could actually add irrational before all these bullet points. So there's loss aversion. Loss aversion means that people hate losses more than they like benefits. So if something entails, if they need to choose between avoiding a loss or getting something that gives a comparable benefit, they tend to avoid losses even if the benefits would be a little bigger. Then there's this thing of risk aversion and also risk seeking, meaning that if some decision entails the possibility of a big loss, even though that the probability is relatively small and the gains are overwhelming, nevertheless, people tend to avoid risky behavior under certain circumstances. So the way it actually works, and there are many lab experiments and also observations of real markets and other situations, that the kind of risk people try to avoid is when the losses can be arbitrarily large or very large, and the gains are predictable. That's the kind of situation people don't like. And so, for example, you can see the absolutely irrational fear of flight and terrorists and things like that we exert far more resources than the harm caused by those things. But also there's the other side, when the costs are predictable and bounded, but the gains are potentially very large, then we tend to take those decisions, which is what gambling is. That we buy a lottery ticket, and even though the expected gain is smaller than the price of the lottery ticket, because that's the whole point of the lottery, people still tend to buy lottery tickets. So that's another criticism of expected utility theory. And the killer is the St. Petersburg paradox by the Bernoulli cousins, which is that there's this hypothetical lottery that you pay a certain amount down, and then someone flips a fair coin, and every time there's heads, the pot doubles. It starts with $1 or whatever. And when it's tails, then the game is over and you get the pot. So with the probability 1/2, your payoff doubles, and then it stops. Now, if you calculate the expected value of this lottery, it's infinite. It diverges to infinity. And yet, if you approach people that how much would you like to pay for being able to play this game with me, you will find surprisingly small amounts. So nobody would offer you, let's say, 1,000 francs for playing this on a beginning with 1 franc. And I don't want to go into this. It's a very interesting topic, and we can discuss it in the bar afterwards. It's not very relevant to interface design. It just highlights that how far the actual human behavior is from maximizing expected utility. That's not what people do. And the things that also affect it are the endowment effect and sunk costs effect, which are also somewhat irrational. Endowment effect is that once you own something, you get sort of attached to it, and you put a much higher value to it than to something that you do not own. the sunk cost effect is somewhat related, that if you keep investing into something, you won't let it go even when it's completely irrational at that point. Now, if you look at rational decision-making, past costs that are not recoverable should not be taken into consideration at all. But behavioral economics observed that that's not how people work. If people have sunk certain amount of costs into something, they're not going to let it go, and it influences their decisions very heavily. So now that we have seen these, we can actually see why certain payment systems are more successful than others, which do not take these things into account. So for example, the most direct payment system, if you do it naively, that, if you encounter a content that needs to be paid, for example, an article, then you can do something that is payment, and then you see it. Why people would hate it? Because it's against everything that you see here. It entails a huge mental accounting cost that is way above the amount of money that you pay, because you just need to make decisions, and it distracts you from reading the newspaper. It entails a possible loss because you pay for it and then you get something that you were not even interested in, and so on. So let's look at something that does work. That's, as far as I know, the only widely used and to some extent successful way of charging people for content: subscription. What's subscription? You upfront, you pay a huge amount of, a non-micropayment. You make a non-micropayment, a substantial amount of payment, and then this way you purchase the right to view a relatively large amount of content. So what are the benefits? Why this is successful? Because the mental accounting tasks are infrequent. So once in a year or twice in a year, you make a decision about whether or not to subscribe, and that's it. You don't need to make decisions every time you access the resource. The actual costs of performing the payment are negligible compared to the amount paid, because in case of micropayments, you have this problem that the operation of payment takes so much time and effort than it is quite comparable to the amount of cents or even millicents that you end up paying. And in case of subscription, that problem is avoided because the task of payment is actually much smaller than the amount of a subscription. And what's also good about it is that the costs are predictable. You pay this amount, and potentially there will be something very interesting, and you can gain a lot, but you definitely won't lose a lot. So maybe this is the solution. So far, at least, this has been the only solution that has worked to some extent, but it has downsides, and whenever we see that something's inefficient, then we should see also an opportunity to exploit. In this case, the problem with subscription is the huge opportunity cost. And since media got online, this is even more pronounced. If you subscribe to something precisely because the amount involved is not a micropayment, it definitely means that it's a sizable chunk of your budget for purchasing content. And if you subscribe to this, you don't subscribe to that, because you cannot subscribe to everything. And on the internet, precisely because of the hyperlinks, we tend to surf back and forth between different contents. And if you have to subscribe for everything, I'm sure that it happened to you as well. You click on a link, subscription required. Damn. So that's one thing why people hate subscription. And the other problem has to do with sunk costs and endowment. If somebody subscribes to a expensive journal, you can be sure that they will go to length to explain why this journal is absolutely brilliant and why you should also subscribe, because they have this endowment effect. They make this commitment, this huge commitment, unrecoverable costs, and from that point on, they are only focusing. So they are consuming that content, they're rejecting content that contradicts it, and so on and so forth, and you become less informed. And on the other side, it's also repulsive because people know, or to some extent we feel that we are that way, so we don't like to make commitments like that. So, you know, if there's a journal with which I know that I do not fully agree usually, and I don't want to fall into that trap, I kind of feel bad about giving them a huge chunk of money just in order to access it for a year. So maybe we could do better than that. So obviously we want to be maximalists, so we want to have our pie and also eat it. We want to have all the benefits of subscription and hopefully none of its downsides. And this is one thing that I have done in 2005 when I was a graduate student at Queen's University in Canada. I did this experiment on campus. It was quite illegal because what I did was I subscribed to a very expensive yet very popular weekly newspaper, which won't be named here. And I set up a proxy, and I was reselling its content based on the principles that I figured out. And I had only one rule to keep the experiment honest. I never did anything that would undercut the newspaper. So every time I made something, it was set up in such a way that the owners of that newspaper could also do just that without hurting their business. So I just went for the lost opportunities with the naive hope that maybe they will notice and they will hire me maybe. The problem was, of course, that not only did they not notice, but the part of this experiment that was even more illegal was not the fact that I used the content of that newspaper, but the fact that I was using university infrastructure for commercial purposes, which is strictly forbidden. But anyway, the solution was fairly simple. There was a web server module with the content provider, and there was a payment processing server, because I was thinking, forward that maybe there will be more content providers. I will have my own payment processor server, and I will make a business. And here's how it worked. So upon you hit some premium content without subscription, you get 402 with a form where you can enter payment. The fact that I used single-use codes is a mere technical detail, so it could be just a yes/no button if you are somehow subscribed to the payment processor. It's a detail. The fact that you get a form where you can decide whether yes, you want to buy it or no, you don't want to buy it. It should be noted that the way that newspaper operated back then, since they have changed their policy a little bit, was that their premium content was only available to subscribers. So even if you purchased the paper edition, you could not access the premium content, and there was no way to pay for parts of the premium content. So premium content was only accessible to subscribers. So once the payment is successful, in my case, the entered code was valid, the payment is transacted, and the premium content was displayed. And if the paid amount was sufficiently large, then a subscription took place. I offered 1-hour subscriptions and 1-day subscriptions compared to the 1-year subscriptions of the newspaper. And I put out in the library some cards with the logo of the journal and a single code that people could just try and use and read one piece of restricted premium content. What ended up happening was that people would take decks of these codes and read them. It was also very educational. Obviously, it was not a very large commercial success, because otherwise I would be working for that newspaper by now. But, it had some sort of success. It was definitely better than nothing, because there was genuine demand for that kind of micropayment. The protocol turned out to be very simple and versatile. The company that I now have, ePoint System, uses the same protocol for selling wireless internet access via little routers, and it's exactly the same protocol, and it's actually is a, albeit limited, but still a commercial success, so it can be used for many things. I also learned that daily and hourly subscriptions make sense. that was actually introduced a few months into the experiment. The bad news is that, making that decision whether or not I want to view that content, it still sucks. It's substantially worse than in the case of I just subscribe and then I don't need to ever think about it again, at least till the subscription lasts. Entering those single-use codes, people hated it big time. And also bad news is that it was not good enough to turn it into a profitable business. So let's have some wish list. How can we make it even better without, compromising on anything? So it should be fire and forget. So you should be able to make something and typically you need not to make recurring decisions about the same thing. It should still avoid commitment. So you should not be, so you should be able to pay one large sum and never think about it, but that large sum must be recoverable. It's very important. You need not to commit that whole sum. And of course, the costs need to be limited in the sense that, the trivial way of making micropayment work, and that's how the cellular telephone service started out, that, when you make calls, they just keep charging you without asking you. And that in the 90s in Europe, but I believe that in the US it's still the case, some operators charge for airtime. So if somebody calls you, they still charge you for the amount of time that you talk. And this is what people hate, because you have no control over who calls you, or you have some limited control, but not much. And there's still a possible loss that somebody calls you, you don't want to talk to that person, and yet you end up paying. And it's very frustrating. So I wanted to avoid that as well. So here's the solution that we came up with. It's something that is built on top of the previously described protocol. So this is a Firefox extension, so basically we modified the browser, which is, the idea itself is from the way browsers handle 401. So if you look at 401 status, what happens is that if you have some restricted content, then the browser would ask you for credentials, which can be a username, password, or maybe a certificate or whatever. So it will authenticate you, and then it will display the content. And it's the same thing. So we added this extension, which handles 402 the same way. Namely, it works sort of like a wallet. So you deposit a certain amount of payment into your browser, conceptually. And if you encounter a 402, first time the browser would ask you whether or not you want to pay. And you have a third option here that, okay, I want to pay for this. Moreover, if a request from the same domain comes that asks for this amount or less, then don't keep asking me. I want to pay it on this website. So the default threshold is 0. It cannot happen that somebody charges you without your consent. But if you keep returning to a website, then it will stop asking you. There's some visual feedback of how much money you still have. And there are some things that ended up being added as user requests. One of the interesting things is that this little visual feedback, some people like it and some people don't. So you can turn it off. Also, it's very important that the whole thing can be turned off. So if you just want to browse and you don't want this extension to keep bothering you, you can turn it off. And it's very important that funds can be both added and withdrawn, which means that it works sort of like a subscription to everything, which is basically what people actually want, that you pay, once you make a decision of allocating a substantial amount of money to browsing, to viewing premium content, but still you don't need to decide on a particular provider of this content. And the good thing about it is that it makes the actual transaction costs very low, because most of the time you don't even see them. And but secondly, you do not have to make decisions that you have once made again and again. So it lowers your mental accounting costs as well as the actual transaction costs. So it hopefully helps that problem as well. And also it will not entrap you. But the bad news is, of course, that we have discussed with my partners what we want to do with this once we have made it. And I figured that this is not our core business, because we're doing, as Peter has just told you, that we're in a completely different line of business. So I just decided to share this experience with you, and maybe someone will find some inspiration in this work. So thank you very much. That was it. And if you have any questions, I will be glad to answer. Yes? Of course. Well, there's still one click. So if you want to, and it, one click is one click too much. In case of content where the potential value is maybe less than a cent, then just making the decisions of whether or not I want to see this, once it's okay. But if in the same newspaper you have that, you have to purchase every article using Amazon's one click, too much. Right, but we're talking about content, information that you want to read. If in case it's an application that you want to download, of course, the payment is no longer micro. So if the costs are in the range of $1 or $2, then it's okay to click every time. But if you're talking about cents, then one click is one click too much. It's an interesting question. Thank you. Oh, okay. So the question was, am I sure that these ideas will get some traction in the news industry, and if they are the biggest beneficiaries of these developments? It's an interesting question. Obviously, you probably know that the American Association of News Publishers has issued a request for implementing micropayment, and as far as I know, Google has also answered it. But back in 2005, when I was experimenting with those things, and I was quite public about it, it did generate a little bit of buzz. So what did happen was that I got interviewed by New Scientist. So in the June issue of New Scientist in 2006, I believe you can read a 2-page interview with me. And there was even a small company that wanted to, it's subscription only. So there was a small company that even had me sign a contract, but it went belly up before they came up with any meaningful product. So it seems that there are some interest, but as I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, and why I really like your question, is that the thing is that you don't know in advance what the optimal resource allocation would be. And it can and if they think that it is their content that people want to pay for, they might be well mistaken. So maybe there are some popular bloggers who can eat their lunch. Because right now with subscriptions, people, brand names are really, really, really valuable. Because you won't make a you won't buy a subscription from a blogger because you don't know him. and you can still buy a subscription from New York Times. So I think that there's a real possibility that if such a system gets implemented, it will actually shift funds from big publishers to the little guy. Yes? Well, you can see that the solution that I have just shown you decomposes this problem completely. So there's the payment provider to which you submit your form on the 402 page, and then when the payment is processed, you get redirected back with a digitally signed receipt of, account, amount, timestamp, signature. You get redirected back, and that server module about which I talked processes it and serves the content, meaning that where the payment comes from and how is it actually processed is delegated to that payment provider, and you can ease the use there. So for example, the very simple thing that we used, which just uses single-use codes, prepaid single-use codes, works surprisingly well. And maybe you could implement something on top of, Google Checkout or something. These two things are completely separated in this model. And once you have established a way of paying, you will still gain all these benefits, and you will never know how the actual payment processing is done. Now, these are things that people typically don't care about. So if you look at behavioral economics again, you will not exert effort for getting your 1 cent back. So no, this system does not let you get your cents back, but if you have paid for one page and it's just 1 cent, it's okay. So you will not sink big amounts of money into it. Just here, if you're not sure, then you say yes, pay once, and the next time you will not pay for it, and that's it. And you lose 1 cent and whatever. So for example, there's one thing that is also well recorded in the literature, that when people move, they buy a lot more boxes than they end up using, because it's still better to have 1 box more or 10 boxes more than have 1 box less. And it's exactly the same case here.
Is there a question here from a remote site? Can I ask?
Yes, so the question was that...
Ask from remotely, please.
Okay, yes. I'm curious about the two issues of market segmentation. The population that wants 1 article is different from that wants 10 articles and could be charged a higher rate, versus people's ideas about fairness, that there's a big resistance of people to being charged a really unfair price, 5 times as much as another user in a different country or something. How both of those two sides interact with this system.
Well, I can answer the first question from some experience, because at that university there are those poor students who do not want to subscribe to the newspaper, but they were obviously willing to shell out a little bit of money for reading particular articles. So I believe that there is a market segmentation here, and there is a market that newspapers that are offering subscriptions only are losing because of this. So I do think that there's a market segment that can be successfully reached this way. And as for the second part of your question, unfortunately, that I cannot answer, because I just have no real-life experience to draw from. But it's definitely an interesting question worth exploring. Right. First of all, I'm not necessarily, so it's not the only goal of coming up with this, not even the main goal. And secondly, well, as far as I know, figuring out where your clients come from is not that difficult, based on IP addresses and things like that, or language settings. And so because of the amounts involved here are micropayments, yes, you can cheat, but probably cheating is just not worth the effort on that small scale. So I would be surprised if someone who just wants to read, New York Times would pretend that they are from India just in order to pay the Indian price. But I don't know. So it's interesting. It would be interesting to find out. Obviously, with the movie industry, it's a completely different. So we're not talking about micropayments anymore there. And with movies, of course, the the region code was well worth defeating. But in this case, maybe it's not that relevant. The short answer is yes. The long answer is very long. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different security measures here, and we can discuss them if you're interested. About the recurring payment, there's one fundamental break here, that it does not allow you charge more frequent. So from the same site, it will not allow you charges more frequently than once a second, or once. So the time is actually, you can set it, I think, maybe the default is once 10 seconds or something like that. So you can put a frequency limit on the whole thing, and there's a default limit, which is somewhat hard. And also, if you see that you're on a page which goes like this, then you stop it. But there's also a hard limit, which is conceptual, and I think it's very important that this is not taking money from your bank account. It's not linked to some big amount of money. No, you first have to put some money that this is what you allocate for reading, and then that's a hard limit. But yeah, for cheating and the providers claiming to have received more payment than they really have, the users accessing content without actually paying and things like that, there's a whole bunch of security measures, but it's a matter of the payment system, and we can talk about it later. Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. Thank you. Thank you. I was anticipating that question being at Google, and thank you so much for asking it. Yeah, it had to be asked, right? Actually, originally I put that into my presentation, but then I figured somebody would ask it. And the answer is that in the beginning, remember I talked about efficient resource allocation. So the whole payment thing, in my view, is just a communication, a feedback between the content producer and the content consumer that tells the preferences of the content consumer to the content producers. And money is the ultimate truth serum, so they are telling the truth with their payment. And the problem with ads is that they put one or even two additional parties into this equation, makes it more indirect, and there are many ways in which the content, so any of the involved parties will try to game the system. And as far as I know, well, the most obvious way in which this resource allocation is not efficient is that some people put effort into putting ads on web pages and other people put effort into blocking ads on web browsers. And obviously, the resource allocation can be improved. It's not efficient because if neither of them did what they did, everybody would be better off without anybody losing because the user doesn't see the ad anyway. But there's a more important waste of resources involved with in the process where there are advertisements. And as far as I know, this company spends a non-trivial amount of money on what you call spam in a very broad sense, namely that you have these algorithms and people are trying to game them and you are working on outsmarting those people. And there's a huge fight going on and a lot of resources end up misallocated. And that money is obviously up for grabs. So I think that if obviously, it's not, so I'm not saying that payment would replace advertisement. No way. Because in many cases, advertisement is very well aligned with content. Those are the good situations where ads are the perfect way of paying for content. But there are lots of cases when the two are misaligned. And the alignment itself, the fact of viewing pages and so on and so forth, they all entail wasted resources on a big scale. And if we can implement direct payment, then I believe then a lot of resources will be freed up and they can be shared between these parties as profit. So that's the answer to that question. Yes. First of all, I do like the idea. So Flatter is sort of a peer-to-peer implementation of this in a way that you can, you have some, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way it works is that you have some fixed pie which you can share between the content producers that you like. And the company that provides that service is paying based on the sum of the things that you end up collecting from these pies as a content producer, right? That's how it works. That's the basic idea. And I think that its main drawback is the fact that it's because the size of these pies are fixed, it distorts the signal of how important people think these contents are and how valuable they are. And so from these two questions, from these two questions, it might provide a good answer to the first two, but it definitely does not answer the third one because you cannot compare your activity to some alternatives which do not involve, content. So you cannot decide whether, hey, I should be writing articles or I should be baking bread. What am I better at? What people value more? So I think that it's somewhat, so by making it not quite payment, you somehow dilute the truth serum. Definitely. So as I said here, so there's that payment processing server, and where that payment processing server gets its money, it's a technical detail, and the protocol is not concerned with it. So it can be. Not right now, but I think it can be added. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it can be modified. So right now it doesn't have that feature, but it can be trivially added. No. No. Yeah, it does. Yeah, that was an important design goal. Actually, I didn't mention it, but I think it's important. There's a industry of paid content which is not very often talked about, but which is the most profitable, which is adult content. And people are particularly adverse of being identified consuming adult content. So we had the needs of that industry in mind as well. Right. That's where the money is, right? Yes. Right, but they do not have such strong need for anonymity. Neither the right. Right. There's an even more interesting one, which actually the company that I talked about, which went belly up, found that there's one thing that people are willing to pay exorbitant amounts of money, which is voting their favorites up. So there are these phone-in calls when you basically vote for your favorite band to be higher up in some ranking, and teenagers end up spending hundreds of dollars, and they wanted to bring the same thing to the web, and that's why they got interested in this system. So yeah, there are many places where micropayment seems to be needed, sorely needed, but precisely because of the things that I mentioned, it's harder than it appears. It requires really, really careful considerations as far as the user interface goes. Well, thank you so much.